Coming face to face with a wild animal is a nightmare come to life. Unpredictable, fiercely territorial, and incredibly powerful. Even zoo-born animals still have their primal killer instinct. Brace yourself as we dive into some of the most terrifying zoo animal attacks ever caught on camera. Hit like and subscribe. This is Fierce. Number 1. The San Francisco Zoo Siberian Tiger. Our first terrifying encounter took place in San Francisco. A group of 3 friends had been enjoying a few drinks when they decided to visit San Francisco Zoo. Brothers Paul and Kulbir Dhaliwal, aged 19 and 23, and their 17-year-old friend Carlos Souza Jr. made their way to the tiger enclosure. Inside the popular attraction were 3 Sumatran and 3 Siberian tigers. One of the Siberian tigers was a large female named Tatiana. She looked majestic and docile, but the 300-pound tiger was anything but docile. Despite being born in captivity, she still had killer instincts, as the friends were about to find out. Intoxicated by a mix of marijuana and alcohol, the friends clambered onto the metal railings surrounding the tiger enclosure. Below, the tigers watched them with wary eyes. One misstep, one wrong move, and they would plunge straight into the moat below. They stood on the railings, shouting at the tigers. They were invincible. They could take on a fully grown tiger, no problem. Or so they thought. After tossing a few sticks into the enclosure, they climbed down from the 3-foot railings and turned to leave. The tigers had ignored their taunts, showing no reaction. With the zoo nearing closing time, it was time to head home. But just then, they heard something in the bushes to their right. Something big was approaching them. They all gasped when Tatiana leapt out from the undergrowth. Carlos was knocked to the ground. The tiger swiped at the brothers, delivering devastating blows to their heads and faces. The brothers yelled and ran away, leaving Carlos to fend for himself. With Carlos pinned to the ground, she sank her teeth into his neck, ending his life in an instant. Tatiana had struck with a mix of anxiety and raw instinct. Gripping his head in her powerful jaws, she dragged his lifeless body from the bushes onto the walkway. But she wasn't finished yet. She could smell the blood from the 2 brothers. Bleeding heavily, they had left a trail behind them as they fled the scene. Kulbir sprinted to the zoo cafe, frantically begging for an ambulance. The staff didn't believe him. Despite clutching his brother's bloodied head in his hands, no one offered help. Instead, they locked the doors, refusing to let them in, fearing the men were drunk and posed a threat to other visitors. After 6 minutes, Tatiana appeared behind Kulbir and Paul, her eyes locked on her targets. Only then did the zoo employees realize that this wasn't a prank. This was very real. When police officers stormed into the zoo, they found Tatiana near the brothers. She lay just feet from Paul, standing guard over her dying prey. She wasn't hungry. She had acted out of fear, eliminating the perceived threat. Turning her head toward police officer Daniel Cross, she then shifted her focus back to Paul. Without hesitation, she mauled him, his agonized screams filling the air as his life slipped away. Daniel couldn't get a clear shot. He risked hitting the victim. But when Tatiana turned and began trotting toward him and his partner, he had no choice. Taking aim, he fired. The bullet struck its mark, and Tatiana collapsed to the ground, dead. Kulbir and Paul were severely injured, but survived the ordeal. However, Carlos and Tatiana both lost their lives that day. But it isn't just animals that escape their enclosures that cause devastating attacks. Number 2. Alaska Zoo Polar Bear. In 1994, Binky the polar bear made news headlines across the world. Binky was held in the Alaska Zoo in Anchorage. His concrete enclosure was hardly the enriching environment for such an enormous and highly intelligent animal, but it was all he was entitled to. He had a fearsome reputation. In 1983, the 1,200-pound polar bear ripped the finger off one of the keepers. But that didn't stop 29-year-old Australian tourist Catherine Warburton from getting close to it. She wanted an up-close and personal shot of the impressive bear. But she didn't realize just how close and personal she was about to get with Binky. Catherine leaned forward and pointed her camera at Binky. In a split second, the polar bear struck out. He grabbed Catherine with his immense paws and pulled her against the bars. Catherine screamed in terror. Binky sunk his 3-inch claws into Catherine's flesh. He bit down with his powerful jaws and pulled at her leg. Immediately, other visitors jumped to Catherine's aid. They ripped branches from overhanging trees and began hitting Binky on the head. But Binky held on. This was all the stimulation he craved in his sad, deprived enclosure. Then, when a few terrifying minutes had passed, Binky released his grip on Catherine, and she was pulled free. The young tourist was rushed to the hospital, where she was treated for a broken leg and deep lacerations and bruising across her body. Binky proudly paraded his enclosure with Catherine's pink shoe in his mouth. Catherine's ignorant actions had nearly cost both her and Binky their lives. Number 3. London Zoo Gorilla. Typically, escapes from zoos are, thankfully, relatively rare. In one incident in 2016 in the UK, Kumbuka the gorilla escaped from his enclosure in London Zoo, and visitors were ordered to seek cover from the 400-pound ape. But Kumbuka, nicknamed the Gentle Giant, never left staff quarters, and the only damage he inflicted was by consuming 5 liters of undiluted blackcurrant squash in the service corridor of the staff block. He was safely returned to his enclosure, and no one was harmed in the incident. Unfortunately, it isn't always happy endings, though, when it comes to people stupidly or accidentally falling into animal enclosures. Cincinnati Zoo Gorilla. In 2016, a male gorilla named Harambe made news headlines across the world, and countless memes have spread about the incident since. Harambe was a 17-year-old male western lowland gorilla, a critically endangered subspecies. He was born at the Gladys Porter Zoo in Texas before being transferred to Cincinnati Zoo. But on May 28, 2016, tragedy struck. It was something that shocked conservationists, parents, and zoo visitors alike, and something that won't be forgotten by those who witnessed the terrible events. A 3-year-old boy was visiting the zoo with his parents that day. They made their way to the gorilla exhibit, but while the parents were looking at the gorillas below, the curious boy crawled under the protective barrier, through some bushes, and fell 15 feet into the shallow moat of water. Hearing the splash, Harambe, the silverback, rushed into the water. There were loud gasps from the crowd. Everybody's hearts were in their mouths as they anticipated what would happen next. Harambe looked up at the audience. Then he grabbed the little boy by his foot and pulled him through the water. The little boy was completely dwarfed by the incredible muscular specimen of Harambe. The gorilla could have snapped the boy in half with one swipe of his fist. But he didn't. There was something odd about Harambe's behavior. He wasn't asserting his dominance over the boy. It looked to some that he was being protective of him. The boy whimpered and cried. He sat in the water, looking up at the gorilla that towered over him. His mother shouted at him to remain calm. It was all she could do before officers and zoo staff arrived. If the boy tried to run then, there was no knowing what Harambe would do. Zoo staff gave the signal for the gorillas to retreat to their indoor quarters, but Harambe ignored the order. Upon arriving at the scene, emergency officers received the order to take down Harambe, as the situation was too unpredictable for any other option. A single bullet pierced the great silverback's skull, and he was gone. The boy received treatment for only minor injuries, but his mother received massive backlash online for her role in the great ape's untimely and unnecessary demise. Although the boy mistakenly fell into the Cincinnati Zoo's gorilla enclosure, other people deliberately break into zoo exhibits, like this next example. Number 4. Bern Bear Pit Brown Bear. The Bern Bear Pit was a bear enclosure in Bern, Switzerland. It was home to Finn and companion Bjork, two European brown bears. Finn was a specimen. He was 4 years old and weighed 280 pounds. Visitors enjoyed watching him lumbering through his enclosure, pulling at branches, paddling in the water, or sunning himself on the small hill. But in November 2009, Finn was in for a shock, as were the visitors to the bear exhibit that day. One visitor decided that he would like to have a picnic with the bears. Some reports say the 25-year-old was mentally handicapped. He climbed onto the perimeter wall and dropped down into the pit 13 feet below. Immediately, Finn rushed over to the intruder. But rather than sit down and enjoy the man's picnic, the bear had other ideas. The bear seized the man in its powerful jaws and flung him around like a rag doll. Helpless against the beast, there was nothing he could do. No amount of struggling, kicking, or punching could stop Finn now. He was in full attack mode. Soon, emergency services arrived and fired rubber bullets at the bear, but Finn didn't even flinch. He continued his relentless attack. The officers didn't have a choice. There was no time to tranquilize the bear. This could only enrage him further, and it would take time for the medicine to take effect. Time the man didn't have. There was only one option: shoot the bear. They fired a single bullet right into the chest of the animal. He stumbled and fell backwards before lolloping off into the undergrowth. The man was rushed straight to the hospital, where he made a full recovery. But Finn was left in critical condition. Stupidity, accidents, and structurally inadequate enclosures mean encounters with zoo animals occasionally happen. They have devastating consequences. Tragically, nearly always cost the animal its life.